Ja, goedenavond allemaal. Welkom op de laatste Artist Talk van dit seizoen en van dit jaar weer al. Georganiseerd door het M HKA in samenwerking met de Antwerpse galerieën. En ondanks de drukke kunstavond hebben een aantal onder u toch de weg gevonden naar de ingewanden van het M HKA. En met recht en reden. Want vanavond is onze gast niemand minder dan Michèle Wolf, vermaard kunstfotograaf. En dit naar aanleiding van zijn solo-tentoonstelling in de 51 Gallery. En we danken de galerie en haar medewerkers dan ook voor het tot stand brengen van deze Artist Talk vanavond. Michèle Wolf is Duits van geboorte en heeft veel gereisd, ook in de Verenigde Staten en Canada gewerkt. Dus het gesprek zal in het Engels plaatsvinden, als u dat allemaal goed vindt. Ja. So from now on we'll do this in English, which I think is more respectful towards you. Some of you in the room probably saw the highly interesting documentary that was made last year by the Canvas Connection on Michèle Wolf's work. That's actually where I learned about your work, the Belgian television broadcast. Do you remember when you picked all the big events from the big book?
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting documentary. Unfortunately, I was looking it up at their website, but it wasn't available anymore online. So after a while, they take them off. But really? Maybe they will send it out again.
Are you sure?
Yeah, maybe I did something wrong, but I'm going to pull this one here. Okay. This afternoon when I tried it was off, but okay, maybe they will send it out again. And this Canvas Connection documentary was focusing on your work and your personal affinities with artists and photographers, and also on your practices in Hong Kong. So Michèle Wolf was born in Munich in 1954, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And he was raised in the US and in Canada. And in 1994, I believe, you moved to Hong Kong, where you still live and work. And since the beginning of this century, actually, Wolf's work has been exhibited in several galleries and museums, kind of all over the world. And his work is represented in many public and, I believe, as many private collections. Also, since 2000, more or less, Michèle Wolf has produced several amazing and even astonishing photo books, some of which have already become classics in their genre. One of your books is in Mattyn Pas' History of the Photo Book, I believe, which I think is a good quality label nowadays to be in that canon of the history of the photo book. So, Michèle, Antwerp must feel almost like the opposite of Hong Kong, I believe. How do you feel about Antwerp? It's not the first time you're here. It's your third show in the 51 Gallery.
Yeah, it's the third or fourth time I've been here. Yeah. It's a beautiful city. Of course, it's very different, but it's one of the reasons which what I like about my lifestyle, that I like the contrasts. So Hong Kong, of course, is very dense and it's 24/7. It's a very intense city, and then you come to Europe, and even Paris in comparison.
It slows down a bit.
It's very slow and it's very contemplative. So in that sense, I love the contrast.
I can see that it's a different ambiance, but does Antwerp trigger the photographer in you, or is it too classic and too conventional as a city?
It's true, it's very conventional. Although I must say I love Belgium in comparison to many parts of France, because the Belgians have a way of improvising things which is very similar to the Hong Kong back door. If you walk around, you see these little repairs which aren't perfect, but they just work. And that's something I really enjoy, specifically about Belgium, which there's a kinship there, I think, with Hong Kong.
Yeah, kind of surreal use of materials and objects and combining them. And
just practical.
Yeah.
They don't really care about the aesthetics that much. The main thing is that it works. You know, if there's a lamppost leaning over, they'll prop it up with a piece of wood so it looks like a sculpture, and you'd never see that in Paris. Everything is perfect.
Yeah, in Hong Kong, some people weren't too glad that you focused on those repaired chairs, because they thought you were trying to expose their poorness or their backwardness or something.
Well, I think one has.
I read it that somebody was almost hassled because of that, because he let him make a photograph of his badly repaired chair.
That incident happened in mainland China. I started the Bastard Chair project. I have to explain actually a little bit about my history. Between America and Hong Kong, there's a gap of 20 years, and part of that I spent studying in Germany at the Folkwang School with Otto Steinert, who's quite well known photographer and the father of the subjective photography movement. And I worked for many, many years as a photojournalist. I studied photojournalism from 1972 to 1976, and afterwards I worked as a commercial photographer for magazines. I did corporate reports. I worked on calendars. So I would call it my commercial phase. And at some point, I call it my midlife crisis because I was 39. I just got fed up with Germany, and I got fed up with the topics I was doing. I was becoming quite cynical, and I just wasn't feeling inspired anymore. And so I decided to move to Hong Kong with my girlfriend, who's now my wife. This was in 1994.
And why was that Hong Kong specifically? Because of the girlfriend? No. No. She's German. No, it was. I was actually in Amsterdam in 1993, and the crisis there one evening really overcame me. I was photographing in the Van Gogh Institute. For a story for a magazine. And in the evening I went back to the hotel, and I just thought, I really wish I could do something else with my life. I need some sort of change. A break. Yeah.
Just a change, some change. And so I really started thinking what I could do. And this was all in the hotel room and on that one night. And I just let the globe of the world turn. And I stopped in many places. So I stopped in Moscow, and I stopped in Buenos Aires, and I stopped in San Francisco, and I stopped in Athens, and I stopped in many places. And I always thought, is this an option? And nothing resonated until at the very end. It was really the last place I landed on was Hong Kong. And it was like an epiphany. Everything in my body just went, yes! It was an incredible feeling. And I remember I just went to the telephone and I phoned my girlfriend. I said, Barbara, we have to move to Hong Kong. And she said, well, come back to Hamburg first and we'll discuss it. But we discussed it, and then we went there in 1993 for a visit, combining it with a holiday, and we were very lucky because when Barbara, who was working for Stern magazine, proposed, she had a good job there. When she proposed that she move to Hong Kong, they gave her a contract. And when they heard that I'm moving there as well, I also got a contract. So for Hong Kong, which was a very expensive city even then, to have a contract, which, it wasn't a big contract, but it was a monthly stipend, so to speak, where we could pay the rent, that enabled us to go there. But my main chore wasn't to photograph Hong Kong. My main assignment was to photograph in mainland China. So between 1994 and 2003, that was the time I was contract photographer for Stern. I worked about 180 days a year in mainland China, and it was a wonderful period. I was traveling all over, and it was still the time when the magazines had a lot of money, so I could spend 2 or 3 months on a story, which now is impossible. There's only 2 magazines, maybe, National Geographic and 1 or 2 others, who would pay that long to work on something, but in the 90s it was still possible, so it was a wonderful job. And during that time, I enjoyed the reportage, but I was getting older and I had other interests as subject matter, which I couldn't really do for Stern, and one of them, the first one, was actually the Bastard chairs, because during my travels I would always see these broken chairs that were still useful on street corners, and if you went through Beijing in 1996, you would see 20 chairs within one block, because people don't throw anything away, and I loved them. I found them wonderful. They were like sculptures, and everyone was unique, and so I started started collecting them photographically, and I also started collecting them physically. So from every trip, I would bring home 1 or 2 chairs. There are pictures of me in the airplane with a little chair next to me, strapped in into the seat next to me, and I would take them home, and my wife would say, "Oh, Michael, another chair. What are we going to do with these?" Because storage is expensive in Hong Kong. But I tied them together, and I tied them from the ceiling in strings. So the whole collection was almost like a tapestry. And I really didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue in 1997 that I would ever go into earn my living through selling my work in galleries. I never knew I had a future pursuing my own projects. But I did it anyway, just because I felt a need for it.
Can we, for a start, have a look at your current exhibition, because most of the people maybe here already saw it, and other people will go there probably to see it after this talk. In the exhibition, actually now in 51, there are samples of 3 series, like Blind Walls, Night Trees, and My Favorite Things. The first 2 were done in Paris, I believe, and the last one came about in Hong Kong. How do these works relate to each other and to your practice? Because there are even 3 invitation cards, which is amazing for one exhibition. So
I forced that on Roger.
And so there's the Night Trees. Those are these, I believe. Yeah. And then the Blind Walls, and then the Favorite Things. How do these works? Did you actually choose to show them together, or is it more like the gallerist's initiative, or how does this exhibition come about in this way?
Well,
because it's a beautiful combination, but not that evident, I believe.
It's not that evident, but I mean, the My Favorite Thing is a topic I've been pursuing for the past 10 years. Whenever I'm in Hong Kong and have time, and usually every day I go out, and Hong Kong is crisscrossed through hundreds of back alleys, behind every building, behind every commercial building, behind every residential building. You have these narrow back alleys, and it's a place where the workmen and the cleaning ladies park their carts. It's a place where people store their mops and their gloves. It's a place where the back doors for the restaurants open up, and you can see all their plastic buckets, and they wash their frozen chicken, and they slaughter their pigs, and there are all kinds of things going on back there. It's a very, for me, it's a very fascinating place. It's a little bit like looking under the bed, because people don't expect you to focus your attention there. So I go out, and because Hong Kong is relatively compact, I go out almost every day, and if I have to go somewhere, I'll get out 5 stops before, and I'll walk the rest of the way through the back alleys. And
in the BRT documentary, you show your favorite spots. It's really amazing.
And it's just wonderful because they're very organic. They're constantly changing. Nothing remains the same. I sometimes just out of interest go to the same spot 2 months later to see what has changed. Or at the moment, I'm working on a series. My framer is just a block away, and when you go up the stairs just to the left, there's a window, and every day the cleaning people hang out their mops and their working clothes to dry, and every day it's a different constellation, and every day I take a picture, and sometimes it's just minimal, but sometimes there are 2 mops, 3 mops, so there are just endless variations of how one can photograph it, and it says something again, of course, about Hong Kong. I love the improvisational quality.
We have an ongoing. You can have a look here, and then you can refer if you want to.
And my working method is to create genres. I see. I can see it from there.
Yeah, it'll be back. It'll be back.
Okay. Yeah. There it is. Yes. I walk around, as I say, I walk around every day and I photograph, and then I come back in the evening and I download all my photographs onto my laptop, and then I just start sorting it. So if I see, I have 3 or 4 strings which I photographed, I make a folder strings. I make a folder mops. I make a folder gloves. I make a folder back alley overviews, and it goes on and on. So I have maybe 40 or 50 different folders with different topics, and they keep filling. And there's a folder chairs or informal seating arrangements. And after a while, when I have the feeling there's enough material there, I make little groups like that, or I'm working on a larger series of books where I'm breaking down the back alleys into different topics. You can see them at Gallery 51. There's Hong Kong Trilogy, which is Lost Laundry, and the mops and the strings and the carts. And then there's Hong Kong Flora, because in these back alleys you see people never throw plants away. And it's so humid in Hong Kong, when you put a plant in a pot which is half dying out into the back alley, it'll soon start growing. So you can see all these interesting improvised flora, and at some point when I have enough, it's a possibility to make a book. And then of course the question is, how does one exhibit it? And this is what I came up with, and Roger is the first one to show them in this way.
They're kind of quite small prints in one frame. It's completely different than the other pictures, which are more like tableaus or monumental compositions.
And I think it's important what you said about the size, because if you're familiar with my work, I work in very big formats. The biggest is 1.80 meters by 220. And it's for the architecture is very important. But 5 or 6 years ago at Perry Photo, I think I saw it first at Jackson Fine Art, and then I saw it at Rogers Gallery, the Yamamoto prints, the small little beautiful, almost matchbook-sized prints. And I thought, you know, what a stroke of genius. You can carry your whole life's work around in a shoebox. You know, it was so, and I loved the small format, and I thought, I just wanted to reduce the size, to do something exactly the opposite of what I'd been doing. And so this topic was actually very well suited to it. I print them myself with a small printer which sends through postcard size papers. I can do everything myself. I have a long 5-meter table in my studio where I can lay all the work out. You can't do that with the architecture. It's just way too big. It's unmanageable in that way.
It's kind of do-it-yourself practice.
Yeah, this you can just spread out, and you can do books the old-fashioned way, or sequences the old-fashioned way, put things next to each other, see which groups work. So the size for me was, I didn't do this topic because the size came later. How do I present it? But for me, it was a very, I was really happy finding that solution, and they work well in groups like that, I think.
Yeah. Those have almost, with their colors and their livenesses, kind of pop art character almost. In comparison with those, the trees look almost graphical, like old school photographs of the 1950s.
Yes.
Is this a deliberate contrast you build in your work and in the exhibition? Because they could have been done by a totally different artist when you see them.
It's true. You have to understand a bit about my recent history. I moved to Hong Kong in 1994 with my girlfriend, and then we got married there. Then we had a son there, and the deal was, when we moved there, my wife said that she'll do this whole adventure with me, but she doesn't want to end up for the rest of her life in Asia. And she said, at some point I want to move back. And if I want to move back, I don't want you to hinder me, you know, to sabotage it. And so in 2008, Barbara had the possibility of working in Paris for the Stern magazine office, and I said,
so you spend your time between Hong Kong and Paris.
So I said, come, you know, go back, but my home, my artistic home is Hong Kong, and I said, my base is there, and I'll go back and forth. I'll spend 6 weeks in Hong Kong, 4 weeks in Paris. So since 2008, I've been commuting more or less back and forth, and I had great difficulties in Paris. I remember the first year we were there, the first month we were there, I more or less stayed inside, because I just...
These were done in Paris as well, right?
Those are done in Paris as well. I just didn't feel any inspiration. I found it just was lacking everything which I loved in Hong Kong. It didn't have in Paris. There was no improvisation. The whole city had this Haussmannian character. Everything looked the same. When you came out of the subway, you had no idea really where you were, because everything looked the same. And so the first project, which Roger also exhibited a few years ago. But then I I really didn't feel artistically comfortable there, and I was always looking for something to photograph. So I would go to Hong Kong and I would work there, then I would come back to Paris for 4 weeks and I would spend time with the family, go to museums, look at shows, but somehow something was missing. And 3 years ago, I was at a friend's house, and he had a very small photograph, black and white photograph, framed on the wall of a view out of a window onto a few chimneys. And I loved the geometry and the triangle and the circles, and I just thought if I could get up onto rooftops, there was something I could make out of it. And I was very happy, because it's always these things that in art, they often start with a glimpse of something and an idea, and then you try to develop it. In this case, I went up and I discovered these rooftops were just magnificent, and they had something to do with my architecture of Life in Cities projects, because you could see in a way how Paris as a city was constructed, with the blind walls in between and the chimneys. So you had a certain formal relationship as well, and I was so glad that I had something I could work on photographically in Paris. And the tree shadows, the story behind these, last year, both my parents died, and I spent quite a bit of time with my father before he died, just because I've been away a lot, and it was important for me to spend time with him. So I went there last year in March for a month, and it was quite a difficult time, because we were often together at the bedside and talking, and I was holding his hand, and I needed to get away. This was in California, in Northern California, in Berkeley, and I would go out, I'd sit with him for an hour, then I would go out for a walk for an hour, and the light there is very, very clear and crisp. And you have telephone poles and traffic signs and telephone wires, and the sun would go through them, and they would cast their shadows on the road. And for me, it was an absolute distraction from this dealing with my father and my history, and I needed something just to get away from it. And I would start photographing these shadows of objects, and I would just photograph in the evening. I would print them out, and in the end, I've never shown that work, but it's something. When I then came to Paris, I just decided, because I'd been looking at shadows for the visits in California, I decided to look at shadows in Paris, and then I discovered in November these beautiful tree shadows when the leaves are gone and it's November, it's fall, and I started photographing them. And if you know my work, I usually work in pairs. I juxtapose things. So the architecture I juxtapose with the little details, and I decided to do something similar with the Paris rooftops and the tree shadows. So I would have the rooftops very big, and I would have the tree shadows smaller. One is black and white, one is color. So you think about color and black and white, and you think about size, and you think about dimension. So it was just a way to combine two projects. And I think always when you see combinations of things, it creates more opportunity to think about things than just something one-sided or one-dimensional.
Sure. Actually, I was seeing the rooftops as still lifes, because they remind me of Morandi paintings, with the bottles and the little things. All those still life elements on the rooftops, and then you have these still lifes as well. So it's also an exhibition on still life in photography in a way or another. You just mentioned that you studied with Otto Steinert in Essen. He's a famous photographer, and as you said, the founding father of subjective photography in the post-war years in Germany. Your website hosts beautiful pictures taken in Steinert's classes. They're really nice pictures, very funny sometimes as well. Can you recall important moments of your times as a student with Steinert?
Oh, many.
Or special? What did you learn from him? Or?
I must say that I think Otto Steinert died in 1978, and I studied with him from 72 until 1976, and he wasn't in the best of health. He drank quite a bit, and he wasn't as fit as he was in the late 60s. But nevertheless, the great thing about his about studying with him at that time, you could still control as a professor who came to your class and not. Okay. So you had to send him a portfolio, and
he had to accept you.
And he had to accept you. So, and he was very, very strict until the very end, whom he accepted. So. I was very fortunate to have a class, to have classmates from all over the world, from Africa, from Sweden, from America, from Europe, and we were a small class of maybe 12, 13 students, and it was just a marvelous time because the school was very small. It was in an old monastery in the Ruhr area, but in a small village outside of Essen. It had only 400 students, and there were only 5 different topics. There was opera, there was ballet, there was industrial design, there was sculpture, there was painting. It was only an arts class. It was very art school, and it was very small and very intimate, and I loved studying there. And I think one of the most important things which I learned from Otto was cooking, because he was a very enthusiastic cooker, and we always on Saturdays had. It was called free photography. So we had different classes. We had photojournalism 1 and 2, portraiture 1 and 2, documentary photography 1 and 2, history of photography 1 and 2. But there was also a free where you could do your own free projects, and that was always on Saturdays. And we always met at 12. And the first thing we did was we cooked for an hour and a half. Every Saturday, something else. And I was 19 years old, and I had never really thought about it. But it was just a wonderful thing to experience, and it awekened my love for food, which I still have to this day.
So you turned a dark room into a kitchen the weekend.
Well, it was all portable. We had a nice room, and we brought 2 cooking plates, and we made mussels, and they weren't complicated dishes, but we talked about the importance of food, and then afterwards we would show our projects, and he would do critique, and so it was a photo class. No, it was the great thing about Otto Steinert was also that he had a very large collection. He was an avid collector, and he had very many friends. So he had Lotte Jacobi and Eric Solomon, the original contact prints of Eric Solomon, who was the father of photojournalism, more or less. And he would always bring these prints to class every week. And at that time, I wasn't really aware of how special it was. Now, of course, I realize it was a wonderful opportunity. But he would pass them around, and we would look at them and talk about them. So, but it was a very different studies in the 70s. It was very informal, and if I look at the Scheine, at the courses, I think in 4 years I took photojournalism 1 and 2, and I took that 4 times, because every time it was something else. I took portrait 1 and history of photography 1, and I graduated with that. It's impossible nowadays. It's so much more structured, the way you study. Yeah.
You graduated in 76 with a documentary project on Bottrop Ebel, 1976 it was called. It's a great series, and it has only recently been published in 2012. Why did you decide to publish such an almost ancient work of you so recently?
Well, sometimes time has to go by for certain projects, and I had never thought about publishing my thesis because I wasn't really. I hadn't thought about it that much, and I put it away. But I was very lucky a few years ago. You were mentioning that I have quite a few books. For me, this publishing of books is a very important part of my work, because it's a way of, first of all, it's a different way of looking at things, because you look at things sequentially. But it's also a way of distributing what I do, because not that many people can come to one specific gallery. The internet is wonderful, of course, as well, but books get around, and it's very difficult to find a publisher. For me, it was difficult to find a publisher who would keep up with the pace of what I was producing, because I was interested in doing several books a year and not one book every 2 or 3 years. So I hooked up with Hannes Wanderer in Berlin, who became a very good friend, a small publisher, but he and I were on the same wavelength, and he was willing to go along with it. And it's in the course of this friendship that he asked what I did during my studies, and he saw the Bottrop Ebel work, and he said, wow, you know, it's wonderful. Let's think about doing a book. So this was in 2010, I think, when we first talked about it, and then in 2012, he said, let's do it. And it's wonderful, of course, if you see 40 years later almost, you see a work which I did. And I must say the Bottrop Ebel was really the first project where I really learned how to work in depth on one topic. I call it peeling the onion.
So actually you were following the daily life of working class people in that industrial town?
Over a period of 1 year.
1 year. And you went there like every week or every day? Or how?
I went there very often. I would go there several times a week. And in the end, I had so many friends there that I could sleep over. So sometimes I would stay there 3 or 4 days.
You must have had thousands of images then.
Oh, yeah, it was all black and white and you know, with contact sheets. And I shot hundreds and hundreds of rolls of film, of course. But you can see the influences. I think one of my main influences as a teenager was Eugene Smith's Minamata. That black and white, socially conscious, you know, work which has a social message. And that was the same. I grew up in that environment. My parents were liberal Democrats. In school, we were all working on the same issues. You know, always for the working class, against the wealthy. It was the leftist
70s in Germany.
Exactly.
Can you, in your current work, can you still trace that social awareness?
Oh, of course.
It's not that much now in the gallery show, but it is in other projects.
Well, it depends on how you interpret it. I think this is quite, this is sociological anthropology, if you want to call it. It's not aestheticizing something, but I think I recently had a conversation in Hong Kong. It was very interesting. It was about 6 months ago. I was sitting in a bar in the evening, and there were 3 other men my age. They were all around their late 50s. And they were all preparing to go back to, one was going back to America, the other one was going back to Europe. They'd been in Hong Kong for quite a while. And we were all talking about our careers. And this one guy he had his own advertising agency. And he was saying, oh, you know, when I was younger, I started off and I was so idealistic and I wanted to change the world. And I said, well, what's the latest campaign you did? He said, oh, it was for Wynn Casinos in Macau. And then the other person told of his experience, and it was similar. And then they asked me, and I'd never really thought of my work in this context, but I thought I can actually be quite proud that I've really never done anything which was against my beliefs, and that this idea of being a socially conscious person, it's always been reflected in my art. Architecture of density is a very clear statement. Tokyo Compression is a very clear statement about life in megacities. That undertone of social commentary has always been there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always feel that your work is very filmic. I'm thinking about Transparent City. Is that the right title of the book? Yeah.
Right.
Where you show panoramas of big apartment buildings, and then you focus on windows, and you can see people acting unseen in their living quarters, like a voyeurist approach. I almost read that book as a film, and of course there are references to Hitchcock and David Lynch and so on. Did you ever feel like making a film instead of photographs?
No.
Why not? Because it seems like an almost obvious result from that move.
It's too complicated. I have to work with too many different elements.
And you can't do it alone.
I can't do it. I prefer working alone. I'm a very solitary person at work. I love going out and walking by myself and discovering things. And a film, I mean, one can do it on a smaller scale, of course, but it always involves more people. And I'm not a person who works well together in groups. I think...
Lonely hunter.
Yeah. Lonely hunter, yes, how romantic. Lonely hunter.
Your fascination for photography, urbanism, and also your use of quite big formats and your feeling for uniformity in composition could be compared to the famous German tradition of the Bäckerschule, like the Bäckers themselves, and Gursky and Struth and so on. How do you relate to this typical German thing in photography? Do you feel like part of that scene or influence, or is it what you do completely different? Because actually they made photography like fashionable in the 80s, didn't they?
It's very different what I do. Just the size is the same, but I'm still a narrative photographer, and which the Bechers are in a way, but Struth and Gursky are not. But I have an interesting anecdote to tell you. When I graduated from Otto Steiner, from the Folkwang School, I founded my own agency. Fittingly called Anthracite, for the coal. Anthracite, because the Ruhr area was a coal-producing area, and we had our office in an abandoned coal mine. And it was wonderful. It was 300 square meters, and we had a small gallery. We had a billiard table, and we had 3 cats, and it was cold, so we had a Swedish wood-burning stove in the winter, and we had incredible parties. Because it was abandoned and you could play music all night. And this was in the early 80s. And then at some point we had to move out of the factory to somewhere else in a normal residential building. We had an office. And then one day, I can't remember the year, 82 maybe or 83, we were looking for an intern, and some people had phoned, and then one guy, I said, okay, why don't you come by? I couldn't remember his name, and he came by, and he introduced himself. He said, hello, my name is Andreas Gursky, and I heard you're looking for an intern, and can you tell me what's involved there? And this was way before he had gone to Düsseldorf, and he was still thinking about a career in photojournalism or at the academy in Düsseldorf. And he phoned then a few weeks later and said, "Oh no, I've decided to go to Düsseldorf to the academy."
And history changed,
which was a very important decision that he made. No, it was very strange. If I look at my history, I just find fascinating how life is often influenced by accidents. For instance, the reason that I ended up at the Folkwang School was an accident, because I was living in America with my parents. I was 17 years old. I had not a clue what to do with my life. I was enrolled at the University of California in Berkeley, doing undergraduate studies. And my father one day said, "Oh, next weekend there's a professor for painting from the Folkwang School coming to visit. Do you want to meet him?" And I said, no, I'm going sailing with friends. I had 4 or 5 friends. One of them had a boat, and we were going to go out and spend the night on an island in the San Francisco Bay. He said, okay, your choice. And so Saturday morning, we all went down to the harbor, got in the boat, and unfortunately, we crashed the boat into the rocks right at the exit from the harbor, a big hole above the waterline. We had to get the boat towed back, And that's how I met this painter, this professor for painting at the Folkwang School. And he was a very nice guy. The first thing he asked is, do you have some pot to smoke? which I said no, but then
San Francisco, of course.
Exactly. And then he said, what do you do? He was just interested. He was a friend of my father's. And I said, I'd like to photograph. And he said, why don't you show me your portfolio? Unfortunately, I had a bunch of photographs in a box, and I showed him. He said, they're really interesting. Have you ever heard of the Folkwang School? And I said no, and he said, have you heard of Otto Steinert? I said no, and he said, well, he's a great, important professor, and why don't you send your portfolio to him and see if you can go there, and you can live at my place for half a year as an exchange. You just go there for a semester to see how it is. So I sent this portfolio away, and I forgot about it, and 4 months later I received a little postcard. I remember I sent it away in February, and in May I got a postcard from the Folkwang School. It says, you've been admitted for the fall semester in 1972. And my life totally changed. I went there and suddenly discovered that there was something that I could earn money with, which I really loved. That's what I discovered there. And as a 17-year-old, I didn't have a clue what I would do with my life and how I would earn my money.
Yeah, of course, Otto Steinert is a pioneer of subjective photography. Another source, not a source, but a reference I could see in your work is August Sander, with his typologies and your portraits of Chinese people. Mm-hmm. Are these references to Sander, are they really deliberate, or are they just like something you have been given in and then that pops up some?
No, they're all this. It's all very deliberate. I know exactly where the influences come from. The portraits of Chinese people are very clearly August Sander.
Yeah, they're almost like a tribute, in my opinion.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. It's quite clear. I mean, the backdoor work, what I find interesting about this is really uniquely mine. It's like I own it. It's no one else really has done this. But I think every artist goes through phases where you quote things, and it doesn't bother me at all.
Is it like going back to the roots or something, like going to the things that in a way have formed you as a young photographer?
No, it's just something which I'd liked as a style, as a concept, and I transported it to something else. Yeah. But I have another interesting anecdote to talk about regarding influences. Like I said, I studied photojournalism, and from 1976, when I graduated, until 2003, which I think is 25 years, I worked as a commercial photographer, as a photojournalist. And you have to imagine that working for magazines forces you to look the way the magazine wants you to look. And I was working primarily for Stern Magazine, and Stern Magazines wanted you to do double pages. And on a Stern Magazine double page, the picture had to look a certain way. You need to have space for a headline. You need to have space for a caption. You can't have the center of the picture with the content, so you cut it in half when you open the magazine. So there's certain formal rules you had to follow. And if you follow these rules for 25 years, it becomes a habit. And when I stopped working commercially and started working on my own projects in 2003, I realized that every time I would lift the camera, I would immediately frame something like a Stern Magazine double page. I mean, it was madness. It was just, I couldn't, no matter what I did. And if I tried to do it differently, it just, I physically, I couldn't do it.
You were Sternicized.
I was Sternicized, not sterilized. I was Sternicized. And so I thought, I have to do something to get rid of that habit. And I had discovered that one of my favorite contemporary photographers, who unfortunately died this year, is a German photographer, Michael Schmidt. And I just fell in love with his work, and he was, his work, Truce, in German it's called Waffenruhe, was probably the most influential project which gave me some sort of perspective in how to go of any artistic photographer that I've been connected with. I knew him personally. I've collected his work, and I knew that when I wanted to make this transition from commercial photographer to the so-called art world, I would have to get rid of this commercial style. It's very difficult to mix these, I felt. And so what I did was I consciously copied Michael Schmidt's Waffenruhe. There are only 34 pictures in it, but they're all done in a very specific style. They're done with a medium format Machina plausible camera with a very low depth of field, so the focus is always on one plane and the background is out of focus. And I used a tripod, I had a Machina plausible, I bought his camera, and I started on my back alley work. It was part of Hong Kong Front Door, Back Door, and if you look at the back door images closely, you'll see that they are consciously done in the style of Michael Schmidt. The threads that you saw there, there's one thread from 2003. It's this yellow thread going down a back alley, and it's just focused on that, and everything else is out of focus. I would have never ever dreamt of photographing that way for Stern Magazine. They would have never published it. And I did that over a period of 12 months, consciously using a tripod, framing things differently, changing the style.
Going against the grain.
Going against what I had learned for 25 years.
Yeah, yeah. One of the topics you really deal with, I think, is privacy and anonymity in the big cities. And the omnipresent cameras in the city tend to violate our basic right to be private or anonymous. As a photographer, how do you cope with that? This threat of your own privacy or your anonymity in the big city? Because you're a photographer. Actually, you photograph people, you bring them in the open. At the same time, in your work, you deal with the issue.
It's a good question. I've been asked that, actually most often I've been asked that regarding the Tokyo compression images, because...
Can you explain what they're about? Because maybe people don't know.
Tokyo compression is a project I did over 3 years, photographed on one train station in Tokyo where there's only one train track, and I'm standing on the side of the train outside where the people don't get in. So they get in on this side, and then the people are pressed against the glass.
Really squeezed off.
Squeezed against, they're like sardines. And I was standing there, and I could literally go within 10 inches of the window, and they couldn't defend themselves because the train was so packed. The only way they could avoid being photographed is that they would close their eyes in the belief that if they don't see me, I don't see them. Or they could raise their hand like that and cover their eyes, or they could try as hard as they could to get behind the metal of the doors. I captured all those elements. I captured people going behind and then just looking with one eye to see if I'm still there. I have one person giving me the finger. But it still doesn't answer the question of, do I have the right to do it? I feel very ambivalent about it. Of course, I feel that a person does have the right not to be confronted with a camera at 8 a.m. during rush hour when you're not at your best. I wouldn't do it, but I think the pictures are quite important. I think the pictures are a metaphor, really an important metaphor for what's going on in megacities. And I think the other crucial element, so they transcend the right of the individual person. I'm just saying that. Of course, there are probably 10 people who can say that's bullshit. But that's the way I argument it for myself. And the other thing is that I think I still respect the dignity of these people. It's not that I'm making fun of them. I've seen many photographs of Tokyo where it almost becomes a joke. You know, if you wait for the last train, everyone goes home drunk. and you have dozens of people lying passed out in train stations, and I think that's something which I'd never photograph, because they're drunk and they really can't defend themselves, and what statement are you making? But with these portraits, I think it's something entirely different. So that's my justification, and I'm willing to argue.
Your project on Google Street View with the fucked up fingers as well. That's the same.
Yeah, it's the same issue.
What did you exactly do with those Street View pictures? How did they come about?
I explained that before.
Yeah, but you made a book out of fragments you isolated.
I made several books. I made 3 books. I made a series of unfortunate events, and then I made Street View portraits, and then I made a book called Fuck You.
But those are images that you didn't take.
No, well, I did. Of course I took them.
Yeah.
I set my camera up in front of the monitor, and then I went through Paris, or I went through the world with Google Street View, and I photographed from the monitor. Okay. So in that sense, they're appropriations, but they're my pictures. Yeah. Because
and you of course selected them. Yeah.
And I cropped them. It's not the whole. It's not the whole. Sure. Even then, it would still be my picture.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
No, but the Fuck You was also an attempt. It was at one. The Fuck You can be interpreted in 2 ways. It can be interpreted that he's giving us, the viewer, the finger, but obviously he's giving the Google camera the finger. So it has several meanings. But back to the voyeurism, there's another anecdote to tell. A few years, there's the 4th book in this series I'm doing, the small books, which you can see at Roger's gallery. It's called Watching Windows, and it's a project because if you're familiar with my work, there's a whole series called Hong Kong Night, which are these facades of the architecture of density taken at night, where you can look into 100 windows or hundreds of windows, and people are watching TV or washing their dishes. But I decided to deconstruct these facades and just to photograph individual windows. So a year ago, I went out for 10 or 15 nights with a very long telephoto, and since Hong Kong has many hills, you can sort of get up into the middle of these buildings, and then I can look in, and it was at night, and I would be sort of like a peeping Tom, photographing, and it was really harmless what's going on. And sometimes I would just photograph still lives, what was on tables, or someone having their dinner, or someone working on his homework. And in the end, I had 29 images, I think, which I was happy with, and I put them on my website and forgot about them. Just new topic, watching windows. This was in November, and then in January I was in Paris, and I received a call from the South China Morning Post from an editor. No, I received an email. Dear Mr. Wolf, are these pictures? Are you the owner of this website, the author of this website? And she sent me the link to Watching Windows, and I said yes. And then she said, we're preparing a piece about Hong Kong. It was a very harmless email. We're preparing a story about Hong Kong, and we wanted to have a few quotes from you. And can we phone you? And I said, I'm not in Hong Kong at this time. I'm in Paris, so it's a bit difficult. And then she was a bit more insistent, and then I suddenly had the feeling there was something, there was some trap there. And I just said, you can't publish any pictures from the website. I won't allow it. Once I do the book and I do a show, you can do something, but I won't. And then she sent back, we've talked with our solicitor, and he said that because you've published it, we can publish it. So I knew that there was some problem. Then I come back to Hong Kong, and there's a big article in the South China Morning Post, the only English-speaking, or the big English-speaking language newspaper, daily newspaper, is German photographer Michael Wolf breaking Hong Kong privacy laws with his new project. And what I didn't realize, and then of course I backtracked it to figure out how it got this far. What I didn't realize, because I don't read Chinese, is that since November when I posted it, there had been a huge discussion on the Hong Kong blogs about what I was doing. And people felt their privacy was invaded. They say, how can someone just stand up there on the hill and photograph us breakfasting? And, and they tried to find specific people who I'd photographed and to confront them with my website. So,
on top of that, you're a foreigner. You're not like...
It's legitimate. The question was the same when I started Chicago. I had the same concept, looking at people. And I was very concerned because I know that Americans are very litigious. They love going to court. And I was terrified that I would just be sued and end up in court and lose everything, and it would be a nightmare. And I talked to several lawyers, and they said, you don't have to worry. In America, the artist has the right to do this as long as you don't use these pictures for advertising. If I use them for something else, it's a different thing. And he says no one can, and there have been several suits. There was this, a photographer last year who had photographed the condominium only full of rich people. He exhibited at Julie Saul Gallery, and immediately these people who were all very wealthy tried to sue him, and they lost. They lost in court. Mm-hmm. Of course, I don't know if that will protect me in Hong Kong because I'm not sure, because every country has different laws. In France, for instance, it's impossible to photograph. You photograph anyone and you'll lose immediately the suit. But still, it's another, there's so many issues there going on. But on the other hand, what is the NSA doing? I think every single conversation we have is being recorded and evaluated in some way.
Sure is, yeah. Okay.
So,
good. Well, we've been talking for almost an hour, so my last question always is to the audience, if they have any question for you. Is er een vraag voor Michèle Wolf?
What I wanted to say is that afterwards we all go back to Gallery 51, so if any of you want to go there and continue the discussion or just look at
the
pictures.
gallery is open tonight, so please join the artist and his gallery crew. But is there now a question in public? Is er een vraag die dringend moet gesteld worden? Niet meteen? Everything's clear. Obvious.
Very good. I guess I said everything I needed to say.
Thank you very much for being here and explaining to us. En u allemaal, dank u wel voor uw aanwezigheid. En wellicht tot het volgende seizoen van de Artist Talks. Tot ziens.